Okay, so I'll take you through the Stephen Lee essay, Why Was the Republic Confronted by Crisis Between 1920 and 1923? Again, a very well structured response to this, so you can learn as much from reading the Stephen Lee essays about how to plan answers as you can as learning actual content. So pay attention to the structure, the way in which he puts this essay together. Okay, so let's get into the details. Zooming in. Okay, so he starts off by defining the word crisis. Again, that's a useful tip for you in terms of planning your own essays for the examination. His definition: the point in a sequence of events when the future is finely balanced between two or more very different alternatives. Okay, so the point in a sequence of events where the future is finely balanced, and it can be sudden or it can be prolonged. Okay, so effectively that moment in time where basically history could go in different directions depending on the outcome of what actually happens. Okay, in terms of broader context, again, very important this, always look at the dates, 1920 to 23. This was not just a period of crisis for Germany, it was happening elsewhere. Now remember, this is a synoptic paper, so although you mustn't overdo it, but opportunities, particularly in introductions and conclusions, to sort of like demonstrate that you've got that synoptic, that broader knowledge and understanding, placing the question in a wider context, and you can do that either vertically by looking at Germany back in time or forwards, or you can look at it horizontally by looking beyond Germany at that particular time. And in this case, this is a horizontal connection. So during the same period, 1920 to 23, there was a similar crisis in Italy, and with Mussolini, who did seize power in 1922. So democracy did not survive in Italy, but it did just in Germany. Okay. So obviously, we need to be looking at the clues as to what was distinctive about Germany, as to why democracy was able to hang on just. Now, there's a second Stephen Lee essay that follows on immediately after this one, and again, I'll do a podcast for you, walk and talk you through my notes, that asks that very same question: why did the Republic survive? Okay, so that's kind of coupled with this particular question. Okay, so this one is about what were the reasons why there was a crisis, and Stephen Lee breaks it down into very logically into there was an economic crisis, and then later further down it moves into the political crisis. Okay, and again, logical approach starts off by, before going into the reasons for the crisis, he just clarifies exactly what the economic crisis was. So again, you need to remember to do that. Don't just jump into giving reasons without first showing your understanding of what the crisis was. Okay, so the crisis was an extreme bout of inflation. Okay, but the most extreme bout of inflation ever recorded, as evidenced by the exchange rate between the German mark and the US dollar, and the rise in the wholesale prices index. Okay, so that's important because a lot of candidates, it's a very common GCSE mistake, and you certainly do not want to make it at A level, is candidates will often confuse inflation with unemployment. Now, unemployment was the problem that came later with the Great Depression, 1929 onwards. Okay, the Great Depression was about unemployment. The 1923 crisis was not about unemployment. If anything, the German economy had full employment in the 1923 crisis. This earlier period, 1920-23, was about rising prices. It was about inflation. So just making sure you understand that. Okay, so Lee then moves into the reasons for the economic crisis. Okay, and different interpretations here. Okay, so the first interpretation was that the economic crisis was promoted by external factors. In other words, it was caused by reparations. Uh, so, with the implication that if there had not been reparations, then there wouldn't have been a hyperinflation in 1923. So, inflation that was there before 1923 turned into hyperinflation as a result of, in 1921, the announcement of the reparations sum. Because that announcement caused the government to print paper money to buy the foreign currency to pay its reparations. Okay. For example, hyperinflation peaked when the Reparations Committee declared Germany to be in default and the French invaded the Ruhr, which resulted in passive resistance, which resulted in a shortage of coal, and the German government then printed paper money to purchase coal imports. So that particular interpretation is linking the sudden and sharp rise of prices that we talk about as the hyperinflation that reached its peak in 1923 as being triggered by, in 1921, the announcement of the reparations sum. Now remember, the announcement of the reparations sum was only made in 1921. It was not made in 1919, okay, when the Treaty of Versailles was decided, was signed. The decision as to the amount of reparations wasn't made until 1921, okay. Now, there's an equally strong counter-argument that there would have been hyperinflation anyway. Okay, and the reason for even without the announcement about reparations, and the reason for that is inflation started before 1921. Prices were going up before 1921, and that it's very important to make this distinction between the hyperinflation of 1921 to 23, and in particular 23, and the earlier creeping inflation. And that earlier creeping inflation, in other words, a creeping inflation is a gradual rise of prices, started well before 1923. In fact, it started before 1921. In fact, it started before 1919. There was a gradual inflation during World War One that was caused by structural problems, okay, within Germany. The later hyperinflation, yes, was closely linked to reparations, but we must always remember there was inflation there anyway. Okay, so that's the counter-argument. And a second theory, which again is an equally convincing and very valid theory, is that the government welcomed inflation. Okay, so this argument is the German government deliberately provoked inflation to avoid paying reparations. Okay, now the argument here is, of course, we automatically tend to view inflation as a bad thing because we tend to view it as savers. I.e., if you've got savings, it wipes out your savings. But if you're in debt, rising prices wipes out your debts. Now, of course, individual people were in debt, but also the German government was in debt. The German government owed a huge amount of money. It had borrowed vast amounts of money during World War One, which it owed abroad, and so inflation effectively was a way of helping the German government deal with their debts. Also, arguably, inflation in terms of the exchange rate stimulated exports because it made German goods very cheap to buy for overseas buyers. So many German businessmen whose businesses were linked to export-oriented manufacturing welcomed the inflation because it stimulated their business. So there are these different arguments. Okay, Lee's argument is that there was a combination of factors. Okay, World War One caused creeping inflation. Inflation accelerated in 1919 when the German government introduced deficit spending in order to finance reconstruction. Deficit spending, remember, is borrowing money, because that wouldn't put a burden on the people. In other words, it resorted to printing paper money. And then in 1921, the Reparations Committee announced the final bill. Borrowing to pay off debts continued. Printing of further paper money was the solution in order to meet payments, not impact on the German population, and it caused the financial collapse to demonstrate Germany's inability to pay. There's another argument, is that, and of course in a sense it worked, because the currency did collapse in 1923, and what resulted is the Dawes Plan resulted in American bailout. With huge loans to Germany. So the argument is that was actually, you could argue it was deliberately encouraged by the German government. Okay, now Lee then moves into the political crisis, okay, which kind of ran parallel to that. So overview, okay, again as before going into the reasons for it, he gives the overview: a series of specific crises provoked by activists who were opposed to the existence of the Republic. Okay, these crises were enhanced by the lack of commitment by the majority of the population towards the Republic. Okay, now early on at the beginning of the Republic, the majority of the people supported it, as evidenced by the vote when the National Assembly was elected, January 1919. 3/4 or 76% of German people voted for the three parties of the coalition that supported the Republic, but by 1920 that had significantly dropped to 47 or 48%. Secondly, the threat from the far left. Okay, so again we've covered this in previous podcasts, but again this is part of explaining why there was a political crisis during this time. There was an ongoing threat from the extreme left. Okay, obviously the Spartacists uprising of January 1919, and then 3 months later Levin's Bavarian Soviet Republic that overthrew Eisner's USPD experiment. And of course Levin's Bavarian Soviet Republic aimed for the creation of a regime modelled on Soviet Russia. Okay, so the extreme left were their ambitions were to overthrow the parliamentary regime of the Republic and replace it with a system of workers' councils. The Russian word is Soviets. Now, of course, that threat was contained by the German army, the Reichswehr, in 1919, Eber-Groener Pact, the use of the Freikorps. Again, we've already covered that. But a sizable proportion of the German working class continued to be profoundly disillusioned with the way the majority Social Democrats, okay, who became the Social Democrats, had failed to bring about significant social and political change. And so increasingly the working classes turned to the strike as their weapon. Now, learn these points off by heart. The rail and miners' strike in 1920, the uprisings in the Ruhr in 1920 led by the USPD and the Communists. There were communist revolts in Merseburg, Halle, Mansfeld, Saxony and Thuringia in 1921. And a dangerous situation in Saxony, particularly dangerous because in Saxony the KPD and the SPD overcame their differences and actually formed a coalition. There should be an I in there. Okay, so learn those as evidence of the fact there was a significant threat from the far left. Okay, that's a reason why there was a crisis between 1919 and 23. It did not suddenly go away after the Spartacist uprising was crushed. Okay, it was an ongoing issue throughout this period, which most candidates are weak on that. Okay, which is an opportunity for you to demonstrate your knowledge, to really learn those points. And then, of course, the threat from the far right. Okay, so obviously what caused it, it was directly related to November, that should be 1918, okay, Germany's surrender, okay, which began the myth of the stab in the black back. And again, remember that we've covered all of that. Ludendorff passing the buck, passing responsibility over to the Social Democrats to absolve the far right of blame. So the beginning of the stab in the back myth, the establishment of the Republic in January 1919, and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. Okay, so how was the threat from the far right made apparent? Well, it comprised a wide range of actions. Okay, now, although it's not written into the notes here, make sure you're clear about who the far right were. Remember, there were two basic strands. There was the conservative far right, who were the old elites, who were dominant in the establishment of the Weimar Republic, so the top level of the army, the judiciary, the civil service. Again, we've covered that in a previous podcast. But also the radical right, okay, the Volkisch groups, who tended to arise more out of those middle class pressure groups like the Pan-German League, and became apparent in political groups such as the Nazi Party, etc. And of course, the conservative right and the Volkisch right, although they were fundamentally different in their origins, their social values, they did increasingly start to cooperate. Now, how was it evident? Non-cooperation in the Reichstag by the DNVP. Okay, the German Nationalist Party refusing to support governments. Revolutionary tactics, e.g., the Kapp-Putsch. Okay, that was obviously an attempt to physically seize power in March 1920 by Kapp and Lutwitz. The inaction of the German army to defend the Republic against right-wing extremists. Okay, so again, very famously, Seect said, German soldiers do not shoot upon German soldiers at the time of the Kapp-Putsch, March 1920. And then, of course, the creation of a right-wing government in Bavaria into a haven, or another word is like a greenhouse, for which right-wing terrorist groups could grow. Okay, so get into the details of who the right-wing government were. Gustav Kahr, Lossow and Seisser are the key names you need to mention. And then, of course, political terrorism. Organisation Consul, for example, assassinated government ministers such as Erzberger and Rathenau. So the threat from the far right was very, very significant as well. Now, we'll continue with more of this in the next podcast, which will be about the reasons why the Republic survived. Okay, so we need to look at the weaknesses of these threats and correspondingly the strengths of the Republic. Okay, that's the end of this podcast. Hopefully that was useful to you. Thank you.